Hi, my name is Dave, and this is a short presentation I put together on evidence linked to Jesus' life, his crucifixion, resurrection, and plus his teachings. And with that, I'll jump into the next slide. Just a FYI, all the materials on this, you can find this on the web just by doing searches on like Jesus' crucifixion, Shroud of Turin, Sudarium of Oviedo, X-ray analysis of the Shroud of Turin. So there are a lot of good links actually on Jesus and his teachings and evidence surrounding kind of the artifacts that are really related to him. So just an FYI, and I'll have some links at the end of the presentation as well. So with that, we're going to just jump into it. So the way I really approach this is more from a forensic perspective. Usually forensics looks at like three types of evidence. They look at physical evidence. In this case, we're going to be talking about the Shroud of Turin and Sudarium of Oviedo. And they also talk about written evidence or verbal evidence. Obviously, we're kind of like talking about the written evidence here. Two pieces of written evidence really on Jesus and a lot of the events surrounding his life. One is the Gospels itself in the Bible, the New Testament Gospels. There's Gospels by Mark, Matthew, John, and Luke, and they all kind of cover various events of Jesus, his life, crucifixion, resurrection. Also, there's a couple of written documents on it from very ancient historians. One is from the Jewish historian called Josephus, and he actually wrote about Jesus in 93, 94 AD. And there's also Tacitus, a Roman ancient historian that talked about Jesus as well. He wrote about 116 AD. The interesting thing about this is when you think about writing about Jesus in this time frame, is it's pretty dangerous to really kind of talk about him or talk about Jesus' teachings. This didn't really change until about 313 AD under Constantine, when he basically said pretty much anybody can study and talk about whatever religious beliefs they have. But prior to that time, you could actually be either imprisoned for talking about this stuff, or you could be murdered, or I'm not sure, murdered, but crucified, or basically killed, imprisoned and killed. So it wasn't really an easy thing to do in this particular time frame. So with that, let's start talking about the pieces of evidence themselves. Okay, so the two physical pieces of evidence, again, Shroud of Turin and Sudarium of Oviedo. Why are they important? First of all, they're two artifacts that are linked directly to Jesus. And what's kind of interesting about the Shroud of Turin is actually it's not only an artifact, it looks somewhat like the cloth, but you're seeing basically a picture of it. And the reason you're actually seeing a lot of detail in this picture is that embedded within the Shroud of Turin itself is something known as 3D evidence. So the 3D evidence actually was embedded in the linen itself. And as the resurrection happened, this is pretty much what all the scientists believe, there's some sort of supernatural event that embedded this 3D evidence in the shroud itself. It revealed itself in the late 1800s when somebody took a picture of it with film photography. And the way film photography works is actually it creates a negative and a positive of it when you later develop it and push light through a kind of like a film, the film itself, onto photographic paper. You get a positive image. But in this case, there's negative imagery in the shroud itself. And that was, you had film photography, which actually has a negative image as well. That created a positive. So that's where you got all the rich evidence. What's kind of interesting too about the Shroud of Turin is that the fact that there's no other cloth, linen like it or image like it in the entire world. So if you think about that from a statistics perspective, about 7.8 billion people in the world, only one type of artifact in the history of the world in the last 2,000 years has 3D evidence embedded in it. And by the way, this cannot be created even with today's technology. So it is extremely significant. The other piece is really the Sudarium of Oviedo. In Jewish religion, basically, after somebody's crucified a couple thousand years ago, they put a cloth over somebody's face and head and kind of attached it. And what's interesting about this is when you start overlaying the two, and that's what we're going to talk about. All right, so when you actually overlay the two, what you're finding out is that there are a lot of kind of correlating evidence between the two, and ultimately what the scientific research has said, there's no other way that this couldn't be, anything but two claws that match each other. It's the same person. They said there's too much evidence. So one of the things that they said, is that first thing is that the blood is an AB type. AB type is very rare. It's like 3 to 4% of the world. So if you're trying to do a fake, you'd never do something like an AB negative. There's other kind of pieces of evidence that are exactly correlating between the two claws themselves. The pollen on it is generally known to be about 2,000 years old and from the region of the Judea region, kind of that's the area that Jesus lived. There's also something that's known as bilirubin that's actually secreted into the blood that gives it more of a red staining, such as what you see on this cloth. It's only really kind of excreted into the body under extreme torture, which of course Jesus was. The other thing, when you look at the Sudarium of Oviedo, it's kind of sort of interesting, is that the features themselves, I know it's kind of very, very faint, but when you overlay this onto this Shroud of Turin, basically what the sciences are saying, or scientists are saying, there's about 70 points of reference that are pretty much an exact match between the two on the front and about another 50 in the back. And that's where they can basically concluded the fact that, these are of the same person. Actually, these two pieces of physical evidence are the same person. What's also interesting about the fact is they had two very different lives and histories. That is, the Sudarium of Oviedo became public in the late 600s AD and resides in Oviedo, Spain. The Shroud of Turin wasn't really kind of known to be public until the 1300s and resides in Turin, Italy. Two very different paths, but again, when you look at them from a scientific perspective, they're both of the same person. The other thing I was going to point out too, and this gets to the resurrection side of it, is that when you look at the physical evidence on the Shroud of Turin itself, you're going to see that Jesus was beaten, his eye is actually bruised over here. You see all these white dots, that's actually blood. So if you think about the stories, they talk about a crown of thorns being put on Jesus' head. This is where the crown of thorns was actually bedded in his head and the blood that resulted of it. You also see a whole lot of white marks on his body. Jesus was brutally beaten before he actually was crucified. And those are all the residing marks of something called flogging or scourged in Roman terms 2,000 years ago, where they actually beat you with a whip that had about 2 feet long and has metal balls in the end to cause maximum damage. The other thing, just going back one slide, you can see where the pins actually went through his wrist, the metal, when he actually went and was crucified on the cross. This is where they drove metal through his wrist, and they also can see the same kind of blood pooling around his ankle area. So it's a horrible, horrible way to die. Plus, he was beaten well before that. All right. So a couple of things with regards to the Shroud of Turin specifically. Again, I mentioned there's 3D evidence embedded in it. A couple of statements from basically scientists up here and one of the pieces of research, but ultimately what they said is that, there's it's kind of like, again, somehow the body dematerialized without disturbing the perfectly formed blood clots in the cloth. So again, it's pointing towards something that we cannot reproduce today. 3D evidence and just the way all this imagery got in the cloth itself. The other thing, when you look at like the Gospels themselves, this one just happens to be Luke, they talk about how 2 women, both Marys, basically went up to the tomb, saw that the rock was unrolled from it. And this again is that if you kind of know the historical kind of like artifact, I'm sorry, not the historical artifacts, but the history of kind of like Jesus, and what they actually found is that both Marys went to the tomb, saw the rock was unrolled, it was guarded by Roman soldiers who had fallen asleep. And ultimately, when they went in there, they found both artifacts. They found the Shroud of Turin as well as the Sudarium of Oviedo in there. And again, one of the things that happened to them too, they're visited by angels, where the angels basically said, or what they believe are angels, and basically told them that Jesus has been written. And this is kind of an interesting thing too, because that was predicted by Jesus, that he'd rise from the dead about 3 days after he was actually crucified. He didn't mention crucifixion, but he just said he would rise after he had died. So again, you have these correlating evidence between the written evidence and the Gospels themselves, and basically what we're seeing over here physically. Another important fact is that all this happened, the scientific analysis happened about 1900 years after all these Gospels are written. So again, these are more than called coincidental. The fact that all this was written 1900 years before the scientists actually knew what was going on or had a theory about what was going on the Shroud of Turin. You can see again, what I included here is just kind of like some of the key facts from the Gospels and what really happened. Matthew talks about he'll be crucified. Mark talks about he is taken away to be crucified. Luke talks about he'll be crucified. And also in John, you can talk about the crown of thorns as well as him being crucified. All right, so what can we conclude out of all this information? Well, number one, that the evidence in the Shroud of Turin and Sudarium of Oviedo match each other. And undoubtedly the cloths actually cover the same person. And the X-ray dating on the Shroud of Turin, which is something that's much more recent, if you look it up, actually concluded that, yeah, the Shroud of Turin is about a 2,000-year-old cloth. The other thing is that the evidence in the Shroud of Turin and Oviedo correlate directly to New Testament gospel readings. Again, we went through this very, very quickly, but they do. The other thing is that in the history of the world, the Shroud of Turin is the only known linen cloth with 3D imagery embedded in it. Again, something we can't replicate today, even with today's technology. So, and then finally, you have the historian accounts of Jesus, that from Josephus as well as that from Tacitus, that correlate again to the New Testament Gospels. So I think, one of the key assumptions we can actually make out is the fact that if you think about the readings themselves and that the readings that we kind of discussed correlate directly to this physical evidence on the Shroud of Turin and Sudarium of Oviedo, you can probably conclude that the other New Testament gospel readings are accurate as well. And so just want to mention a few of them that are probably important to you. One of the things that happens again in history in the Gospels is that when Jesus is doing his teaching, one of his disciples asks, hey, what's the most important thing we should pay attention to? And Jesus responds, he said, just basically love thy Lord, the God, with all your heart, with all your mind, and all your soul, which is pretty important. He's basically saying, try and do the best we can to love God. And that's kind of a tough one sometimes because we don't have a direct relationship with God like we might have with our partner, spouses, friends, etc. The other thing is that he says right thereafter, and he goes, by the way, you should love your neighbor as yourself. Basically, what he's trying to say or what he's trying to convey is that if you can figure out how to love your neighbor like yourself, then you're probably doing justice to actually loving God as well. Because if you can love that neighbor, then you can love God. You're really kind of serving first one with the second one. And what's also interesting about loving your neighbor is that that's not just the people like, that's pretty much everybody. So you're trying to put your best foot forward with regards to loving everybody in the world. The other thing that kind of goes right around it is the golden rule, and this is not only kind of prevalent in Christianity, it's prevalent in other religions as well, which is basically treat others as you want to be treated, or treat thyself as others you treat others. And fundamentally, you can kind of start seeing the theme here is that love and treating others with respect, with dignity, etc., is really important. The other things that Jesus talks about is basically when it gets to kind of like personal items, personal things in the world, and these kind of correlate directly to the other which I just talked about. But it's not about storing up, things for yourself or treasures on earth. Yeah, we can all accumulate things, and there's things we like, but really what we want to do is be mindful about the fact that you're trying to store up treasures in heaven too. So again, going back to, the golden rule is that if you treat others with respect, you do things for others that kind of need your help, you're basically serving this purpose, which is storing up treasures in heaven. The other thing that I just want to mention is that, from Jesus' perspective, he could have easily been king of the world. He is a very good teacher, very good orator, very good speaker, etc. But he didn't come on earth to kind of be some sort of a leader from that perspective. He basically came to serve others and not necessarily, be some sort of king. He also died for us. I mean, that's basically why he's crucified on the cross, is that he died for our sins so that we could have a kind of a different relationship with God, one that says fundamentally we can be forgiven for our sins and try and do the best we can to move forward. So those are some of the biggies. I left a couple others for you that are pretty prevalent, I guess, in my life, or some things I try and keep mindful of. And then the other thing I was just going to mention too is that I'll just stop here for about 5 seconds. These are some of the key, I call it research artifacts that are out there that I use to put this together. So we have a couple of them here, and we also have a couple of them. A couple of them here. So hopefully you find this helpful. Hopefully it helps you on your journey as well. Hopefully it tries to answer a couple of questions for you. And take care.